Hey, I gave you a pair of survivors and I asked, if only one could survive the trial, which one is it? We then paired up the winners and kept going until there was only one remaining. So who did you say would be the one survivor who would outlast all the others? Let's find out. Now, I kept the question purposely vague, but to give you some context as to what I was thinking behind it, I envisioned that each pair of survivors are in a real trial together. They aren't facing off against each other, but they're working together with two other random survivors in order to escape a normal trial. However, the arbitrary rules I set up for this scenario meant that only one of the pair could make it out the exit gates at the end. So the question is, who escapes? So we begin round one with Dwight and Rebecca, and Rebecca wins with 81%. Now, I fully agree with this. Granted, Dwight is, he's kind of themed around being a leader. He can rise to the occasion, but ultimately, he's just a dude who works behind a desk. Where Rebecca is a trained STARS member. Granted, she's a rookie STARS member, but in order to be a STARS member in the first place, you have to have some pretty exceptional training. And so she's going to be much more experienced and trained than Dwight is. To me, the only way Rebecca doesn't make it out and Dwight makes it out instead is if Rebecca actually sacrifices herself to make sure that Dwight gets out. If that were the case, then I could see Dwight escaping, but just based on their skills alone, Rebecca is the most likely one to escape, for sure. All right, next up we have Meg versus Ada, and Ada wins this with 86% of the vote. And I absolutely agree with this. I mean, Ada is trained and skilled in covert ops. She survived incredibly terrifying things already in the Resident Evil series, and she has the intelligence, training, and abilities to get out alive. I think she'd probably try to help Meg escape with her, but if only one of them is making it out, it's definitely going to be Ada. Next up, we have Claudette versus Hattie, and Hattie wins this one with 64% of the vote. So this one's much closer, but I still 100% agree with this. I love Claudette as a character. Most of you know this. But Hattie has essentially been shown windows into the entity's realm most of her life, these crossovers between realms. And so she has lots of experience with the supernatural and kind of a glimpse into what the entity's realm is like. So that's a bit of an advantage for her. She's also incredibly tough and highly focused. And so combine that with her experience with crossing over into the entity's realm or being able to see into it, I think she's going to escape. I think it gives her an advantage. And so I agree with the community. Hattie definitely escapes this one. Next up, we have Jake versus Yoichi, and Jake wins this one with 58% of the vote. So the votes are getting closer on these ones. And to be honest, I'm kind of conflicted on this one. Honestly, I think Yoichi has a good chance of surviving. Jake is a survivalist, which means if he can stay hidden, he actually probably stands a pretty good chance himself. And so, I don't know. I kind of come out 50-50. Jake versus Yoichi. I could see this going either way, which probably explains why this was the closest one yet. All right, next up we have Nia versus Jonah, and Nia wins with 72% of the vote. Now, I'm torn on this one too. I know that a lot of people are going to point to Jonah and his time with the CIA. However, I want to point out that Jonah was an analyst with the CIA, so I'm not entirely sure how much field training he would have. That being said, he is incredibly intelligent, so that is an edge. But Nia also has street smarts and is pretty good at evasion. She's used to it. Honestly, I think I kind of lean Jonah on this one. But again, I might be closer to 50-50 overall. I could see this going either way. Unless, of course, Nia is the entity, in which case she definitely survives, and this isn't a fair matchup at all. All right, next up we have Lori versus Michaela, and Lori wins this one with 72% of the vote. All right, so this is going to be one that I fully disagree with the community on, because I think Michaela gets out. Yes, Lori is the classic final character, but ultimately she's just a normal human. And we can't point to her experience fighting Myers because this is actually in DBD, this is the original Lori we have from the first movie. So she's got very little experience evading and fighting Myers at this point, right? That said, in my estimation, Michaela is probably one of the most powerful survivors in the realm due to her boons. She's one of the few survivors who can actually alter the rules of the trial through her abilities. And so lore-wise, this makes her incredibly powerful. And so because of that, I honestly believe Michaela would survive this round. But the community voted Lori, so Lori's moving on. All right, next up we have Ace versus Leon S. Kennedy. Leon wins with 86%. And I 100% agree with this. There is no doubt in my mind. And it's not just because I love Leon. Yes, Ace is lucky, but Leon is a stud. As a rookie, Leon was able to survive incredible odds, battle insane monsters, and live to tell about it. Ace is lucky, but Leon is skilled. And so Leon survives, no doubt. Unless, again, he was to sacrifice himself to get Ace out, which could be a thing that Leon does. But coming down to just skill, it's going to be Leon, for sure. All right, next up we have Bill versus Jill, and I didn't realize until I spoke it out loud how much fun that is to say. Now, Jill wins with 62% of the vote. Not a huge margin, but still pretty good. And I 100% agree as well. And here's why. Both of them have the military experience, and both of them have experience fighting zombie hordes. However, there is no world that exists where I would buy that Bill would leave without making sure Jill gets out first. which in this scenario would mean he'd have to sacrifice himself. I cannot buy that he would leave and leave Jill behind. No. That's not the type of guy Bill is. No matter what, Bill would make sure Jill escapes, which means in this scenario, Bill doesn't make it out. Right, next up we have Feng Min versus Yoon Jin, and Feng wins with 52% of the vote, which if I'm keeping track accurately is our closest matchup yet. And I ultimately agree, but kind of with the community, it's really kind of close to 50-50 on this one. Yoon Jin is fierce and a survivor for sure, but Feng also has the mindset of viewing the trials as challenge. She doesn't fear the entity's realm, and I believe this would give her just enough edge to improve her odds of escaping over Yoon Jin. But I'm kind of with the community on this one, pretty close to 50-50. Even though I lean Feng, it's a close one. I could easily be swayed the other way. All right, next up we have David versus Elodie, and David wins with 71% of the vote. I'm torn on this one. Maybe. I'm not like upset with the result. I can definitely see that happening. I think both of them are really tough. David's a fighter and Elodie's a skilled evader. So I kind of think that Elodie would be able to stay off the radar more and David would be more likely to confront the threat head on, which would probably lower his chances and raise her chances, to be honest. So I kind of lean Elodie on this one. But I do see the argument for David too, so I'm not in total disagreement with this result. All right, next up we have Quentin versus Felix, and Felix wins with 58% of the vote. And I'm okay with this one. Like a lot of these, I could see them going either way. Felix is definitely incredibly intelligent. I think he's a little more mature and has more life experience. He also has some awareness of the entity's realm going in because of his father's stories that he told him when he was young. So I think this might give him a little bit of an edge, knowing how the realm works. But then Quentin also has experience battling supernatural forces in terms of Freddy in the dream world. And so Quentin's definitely proved himself very resilient. So I'm kind of torn on this one. I honestly could see it going either way. But I do lean with the community towards Felix on this one. All right, next up we have Tap versus Cheryl, and Cheryl wins with 84% of the vote. And this is one I can easily agree with. Cheryl, hands down, is one of the most powerful survivors in the realm. And also, I believe Tap would make sure Cheryl gets out. So unfortunately for him, in this scenario, it means Tap doesn't. All right, next up we have Kate versus Zarina, and Zarina wins with 54% of the vote. And this is another close one, both for the community and for me. I'm 50-50 as well. Gut level tells me Zarina. However, Kate did escape the entity once herself before being taken into the realm. So that makes me kind of lean back towards Kate. But I guess I'm just saying I'm more 50-50. And honestly, this result doesn't bother me at all. So I'm okay going with Zarina on this one. All right, next up we have Adam versus Yui, and Yui wins with 84% of the vote, which I totally agree with. And the reason why is Adam has already given his life once before to save someone. And so I absolutely believe he would do the same thing again for Yui. And on top of that, Yui is incredibly resilient and strong herself. And so in my mind, Yui is definitely going to be the survivor in this pairing. Now we come to Jeff versus Steve, and Steve wins it with 77% of the vote. And I also agree with this one. Jeff was a capable fighter, but he's now more of a pacifist. And in the show, Steve proves himself over and over again, being able to handle threats and surviving. Now, technically, Steve was taken into the realm before most of the show had happened. It's probably around season 1 or 2, according to DBD lore. But having seen him through the show, we already know he's very, very capable. So even if he hasn't experienced a lot of those things yet, the potential is there. And so my vote is on Steve. I think he would survive this round. All right, next up we have Nancy versus Jane, with 80% of the vote going on Nancy. So again, I agree with this one. Everything I said about Steve could also be said about Nancy, if not more. She's one of the strongest characters in the show, and so I believe, hands down, she would survive this pairing. I like Jane a lot. I don't think she can outlast Nancy. All right, that leaves Ash, who gets a bye for round 1. Well, technically also Vittorio, but in full disclosure, I actually ran these polls before Vittorio was released. However, that said, if I was to pair him up with Ash, I'm fairly confident, knowing how the community feels about Ash, that Vittorio would lose to him anyway. That said, I do think Vittorio is a very capable survivor. For one, he's got an incredible amount of experience in the entity's realm, having wandered it for centuries. And so he would most certainly outlast most of the survivors on the roster, given his experience and skill alone. He's also a very capable fighter, even if he's more of a pacifist himself. However, I also believe, based on his lore, that he'd be very likely to sacrifice himself for others. But all in all, if he's paired up with Ash, I'm fairly confident the community would vote Ash. And I would too, because though I think Vittorio outlasts most survivors on the roster, Ash is one of the few that I don't think he does because of who Ash is. He's just pretty awesome. Not saying Vittorio's not. Ash is just more. All right, next up we have round 2, and Ash goes against Rebecca. And Ash wins this, 64%. And I agree. If Ash doesn't sacrifice himself to make sure Rebecca gets out, he's got to win this one. I mean, he kind of has to survive most trials. It's kind of his thing, surviving against evil hordes. So his experience fighting supernatural forces combined with his luck makes him the most likely survivor in this case. All right, next up we have Ada versus Hattie, and Ada wins this with 86% of the vote. And again, I agree. Hattie is tough for sure. I think a lot of Hattie. But Ada has escaped incredible odds before, and she would do it again in this case. She's also got plot armor on her side. So out of the two of them, in my mind, Ada survives. Now, I know some people might want to point out that Hattie has fought monsters herself. However, that is Tome Hattie, who is actually a different multiversal version of our Hattie that we have playable in-game. But the Observer also makes some comments about how those are probably actually more like legends that brewed up through the multiverse rather than actual fact. So I don't think we can actually count that in for Hattie in this case. Hattie has seen some supernatural stuff. She's seen the crossovers into the entity's realm, but Ada has just survived so much, has the training, has the experience. I think Ada gets out, not to mention the plot armor. Right, next up we have Lori versus Leon, and Leon wins with 82% of the vote. And I technically agree here. Leon is a trained police officer, and he's survived so much up to this point, even on his first day on the job. Now, where I sort of disagree is I have a really hard time, similar to Bill, envisioning Leon escaping without Lori. I'm pretty sure he would sacrifice himself to make sure she gets out. But I'm also okay with the result of him winning this one, because he's pretty much a stud. Hey, if you're enjoying the video and you haven't already subscribed to the channel, would you please consider doing so? It would mean a lot to me. Also, I don't advertise this enough, but we have a Discord server that you're welcome to join. Link is in the description. Come hang out, come chat with us. It's an awesome community. All right, next up we have Jill versus Feng Min, and Jill wins this with, I believe, 85% of the vote. And I entirely agree with this one. Jill is trained Army Special Forces and a STARS team member. She has survived the Spencer Mansion and much of RE3 before being taken into the fog. She's easily one of the most capable survivors on the roster. So in this pairing, Feng's only hope is that Jill sacrifices herself for Feng to get out. Otherwise, it's 100% Jill. All right, next up we have David versus Felix, and David wins this with 77% of the vote. I mostly agree with this. Felix does have the knowledge of the realm, or at least some background knowledge of the realm through his father's stories, but David is more of a fighter than Felix, and that gives him a bit of an edge in such a dangerous environment. But again, I could also see the scenario where Felix is able to stay off the radar a little bit more and David takes the threat head on. And again, that would lower David's odds and raise Felix's quite a bit, just the way the trials work. So in that case, I would be more inclined to vote Felix. But ultimately, I'm okay with this result. Next up, we have Cheryl versus Zarina, and Cheryl wins with 89% of the vote. And I fully agree with this one. Cheryl has survived immense supernatural danger before, and she is one of the most powerful survivors in the realm. So I like Zarina, but if someone is escaping, it's definitely Cheryl. All right, and this one is going to break our hearts no matter what happens, especially if you're a Stranger Things fan. It is Nancy versus Steve. And Steve wins it, 64%. And I'm sorry, this one I entirely disagree with. First off, I think people majorly underestimate how strong Nancy is, how smart she is, how resilient she is. And it's not to say that Steve isn't those things. But what convinces me that Nancy would survive is that I cannot imagine a world that exists in which Steve goes out those exit gates without Nancy. In my view, there's a 100% chance that Steve would sacrifice himself to make sure Nancy gets out. This isn't one of those, well, he might or might not. He absolutely would. There is no way he waltzes out of those exit gates without Nancy. He's going to make sure she gets out, even if that means he doesn't, which in this case, it would. But the community voted Steve, so Steve moves on into the next round. All right, next up we have Jake versus Nia. We have Jake versus Nia, and Jake wins this 64%. Okay, putting aside the theories that Nia is the entity for a moment. Both of them are skilled in being sneaky, just in different contexts. Jake is a wilderness survivalist, so out in the wilderness, he's got it down. Nia is used to hiding in urban settings, hence urban evasion. So in a lot of ways, this matchup would depend on the map spawn, because some of the maps are more urban, while others are more rural. Now, I could totally be wrong, because I don't know for sure. I've never actually sat down and counted, but I feel like a majority of the maps in the game are more rural than urban. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that. But if I'm right, that would actually favor Jake in this one. So I think I'm talking myself into agreeing with the community. Jake could definitely be the survivor in this pairing. And finally, to round out round 2, Yui gets a bye. So moving on into round 3, we have Cheryl versus Ash, and Cheryl wins this with 61%. Now, this is a closer one for sure. Ash and Cheryl are definitely two of the strongest characters in the game. Ash has fought hordes of evil, and he has luck on his side. And Cheryl has obviously survived the horrors of Silent Hill. But there is one thing that I think sets Cheryl above Ash for me, and that's in her ability to call upon the entity to work on behalf of the survivors. It's the same language used for a lot of the killer perks, calling upon the entity. She's the only survivor with a connection to the entity itself, which to me suggests that she is incredibly powerful and the most likely one to survive in this pairing. I could be swayed for Ash. Ash basically has really, really thick plot armor, so it's kind of baked in, but I'm a little bit more Cheryl at this point. All right, next up we have Yui versus David, and Yui wins this with 67% of the vote. And I'll agree. Once again, I think David, I keep saying it, he will take on the threat head on, and Yui would be able to stay more off the radar. And so especially in this scenario, I think David ends up sacrificing himself to make sure the others, aka Yui in this case, get out. All right, our next one was painful for me. Leon versus Ada. No matter what, I'm going to be sad about this result. Leon wins with 66% of the vote. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm glad Leon won. He's my favorite RE character. But the flip side to that is then it means Ada lost, which hurts. So I don't know how to feel. I'm very conflicted. So here's my thinking. I don't think either one would willingly leave the other behind. To me, this would come down to a battle of who could sacrifice themselves for the other first. So if that is the scenario, my vote is on Ada to win that battle and sacrifice herself to make sure Leon gets out. So it's not necessarily that Leon is the better survivor. It's actually more Ada would probably beat him in not surviving, if that makes any sense at all. So ultimately, I'll agree with the community on this one. Leon escapes. Now, to prevent us from having yet another bye moving into round 4, I decided to pair up the remaining 3 survivors in one. And so we have Jill versus Steve versus Jake, and Jill wins this with 77% of the vote. And I absolutely agree. Out of the 3 of them, Jill has the most experience and the most training. I don't think she'd be happy to leave those 2 behind, but ultimately, my confidence is in her escaping. And so now we come to round 4, and we have Yui versus Cheryl. Cheryl wins this 77%, which actually is surprisingly low to me because I absolutely agree. Cheryl wins this. Cheryl escapes. Again, she is one of, if not the most powerful survivor in the realm. Yui's a strong character for sure, but Cheryl is just more powerful. And Cheryl has way more experience going through the literal stuff of nightmares. And so I 100% agree with the community on this one. Cheryl escapes. All right, next up we have Jill versus Leon, which is another painful one. And Jill wins this with 61% of the vote. So pretty close, but Jill's the definite winner, and I absolutely agree. As much as I love Leon and as highly as I think of him, the fact is Jill is just better trained and has more experience. You gotta keep in mind that Jill is ex-Army Special Forces. She's a STARS team member. She survived all of Resident Evil 1 and most of Resident Evil 3 by the time she's taken into the fog, whereas the version of Leon we have in the game is the Resident Evil 2 Leon, taken near the end of or right after Resident Evil 2. So ultimately, they both have great odds of survival, but if only one can make it out, it's gonna be Jill. I agree with the community. Now we come to the final round, Jill versus Cheryl. And I'm gonna be honest, this one surprised me. Jill wins it with 57% of the vote. I thought for sure Cheryl was gonna win. Now don't get me wrong, I'm happy that a Resident Evil character won it, but from a pure lore perspective, I would have to go Cheryl myself. Jill is incredibly capable, as I've already argued, and has superior training. Both have survived horrifying experiences. But as I said earlier, what leads me to say Cheryl is the fact that she has that connection with the entity, that she can call upon the entity to work on behalf of the survivors. That's just insane to me. And so with her abilities, I just feel she's going to be the most likely one to survive. So all that to say, I'm glad Jill won, but I would have voted Cheryl myself. All right, so those are the results. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And thank you to those of you who have watched this far. And if you're still watching, I have a favor to ask of you. Next week, I intend to release my next lore video, which will be on Hattie Core. A lot of content creators are coming together next week to show some love to Hattie's character since she hasn't gotten a lot of attention since release. Now, I love doing these lore videos, and I'm really excited about this one for Hattie. The catch is, not a lot of people seem to want to watch the lore videos. Those that do watch them seem to really enjoy them, but not as many people click on them. Now, I'd love for this Hattie lore video to get some proper attention. So I'd like to ask you to keep your eyes out for that video. And if you're willing, when you see it, give it a watch, like the video if you enjoy it, leave a comment down below, even if it's just for the algorithm. That way, hopefully it will get picked up and shown to as many people as possible. I'm super proud of it, and I genuinely think you will enjoy it. So I'd appreciate any support for it to help make it successful. That being said, you are awesome, stay awesome, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.